and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttin.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with a survey by a Singapore research centre, the Asias Yusof Isha Institute. This survey was titled The State of Southeast Asia 2020, which found that a majority of Malaysians disapproved of the resettlement of displaced Rohingya people in Malaysia. Now, this is quite ironic given that Malaysian respondents were also the most dissatisfied with the way ASEAN is dealing with the Rakhine issue. Now, what do you make of this incongruity, Sharaad?
Well, of course, there's the comparative perspective in this as well. It's not just Malaysians who were surveyed, others from around the region, including Filipinos and Indonesians, who are apparently, at least on the face of it, are much more sympathetic, open to the idea of resettlement in their own countries. But I think you can't discount, Melissa, the cost of taking on the burden of refugees and displaced people, especially ones who are traumatized. And this, humanitarian efforts are great, and governments are often, willing to do so. But local populations do bear the cost of it in terms of taxpayer money, the space. Sometimes we think of, how the Turkish government has allowed, over 2 million Syrian refugees to occupy parts of the country, right? So there is pressure on local populations, there are pressures on resources that might come into bear. So that might be part of the reason why Malaysians might be pushing back on this.
You reckon it's the cost? Now, I was quite surprised by this, to be honest with you. I didn't think about the cost element because, again, the Malaysian government has been a leading voice in support for the Rohingyas. Tun Dr. Mahathir last year, I believe he hit out at the lack of will by the UN and its inability to intervene in the Rohingya crisis. Malaysia also gives, as you mentioned, humanitarian assistance. We host about 150,000 Rohingya refugees here in Malaysia. It operates that field hospital, Cox's Bazar, in Bangladesh. So I'm thinking from the very top level that the government wants to help displaced Rohingya people, but why is it that Malaysians on the ground feel like they do not want the resettlement of Rohingya people in the country, given that it's a Muslim majority country and these are, Muslim Rohingya, right? Well,
I think the core religionist angle is probably what will strike people first as a reason for thinking this is incongruous. So there's something odd about people's attitudes considering the so-called affiliation. But I think it's probably deeper than that. And I think the Malaysian government, in wanting to see a just settlement on the Rohingya issue, would, as much as the refugees themselves, would want to return to Rakhine safe and secure with their properties re-established and so on and so forth, their security reassured, or assured rather. So I think it's a complicated thing. Well, I don't think that we should necessarily run away with the idea that it's about heartlessness on the part of Malaysians, as such.
That's fair, but do you think that Malaysians are perhaps more sympathetic to other refugees from other countries? I mean, we also host refugees from the Palestine, from Yemen, Syria. Remember Bosnia? We took in a number of war refugees from Bosnia. Do we hold different countries in different esteem?
Well, I think that often, Melissa, has come up in social media, and there's a bit of mockery about this, about that perhaps race plays a part in it. Bosnians being prettier than Rakhine or Rohingya, and I don't think that's necessarily true. But whatever it is, there's the idea of some sort of aesthetic dimension to it. I actually don't think that's what's going on. When you think of what happened during the Bosnian crisis, the numbers, I think, of Bosnians who came here much smaller. And I think numbers do play a big part. And actually, when you go back to the 70s and the way Malaysia handled the Vietnamese boat people crisis, Malaysia was extraordinary in many ways in extending support to the Vietnamese. Pulau Bidong, because we had that terrible camp down in not Sungai Buloh, but on the way to Bangi. Those camps were quite bad in the sense of, but nevertheless, Malaysia, I think, has been seen to be a country that, while it hasn't signed on to the necessary conventions regarding the rights of refugees, has actually, in practice, practice gone quite a long way.
Extended a helping hand. All right, well, let's take a look at other news of the day. We have past party president Datuk Sri Hadi Awang today saying that the G25 was more dangerous than al-maunah. So the G25 is a group of retired senior civil servants which claims to be, if I may quote their Facebook page, quote-unquote, committed to pursue a peaceful, tolerant, moderate, multiracial Malaysia. Now, the al-maunah is an Islamic militant group that stole weapons from a military armory back in 2000. They took 4 hostages and killed 2 of them, a policeman and a soldier, before surrendering. Now, coming back to Hadi Awang's comment, this was what he said. We have experienced a time when al-maunah, a group that indulged in prayer rituals but ignorant of Islamic jurisprudence, attacked an army camp and endangered the lives of people. This group, the G25, and its ilk are more dangerous than al-maunah as they are a threat to Muslim beliefs. What do you think?
Well, Melissa, I mean, you know, especially for non-Muslims like myself, but a Malaysian who, you know, I guess shares the space with Muslims, these kind of statements are troubling, partly because it seems to suggest, I mean, there might be a theological basis to Hadi's concerns. I mean, he clearly, I mean, I don't know if he's been quoted correctly, but if we accept on face value this report, the idea that he's actually talking about the belief systems. What is it that G25 is threatening?
Well, okay, so
and how is it threatening?
I'm just going to come back and give a little bit of backstory. So last weekend, G25 released a report that questioned the administration of Islam in Malaysia as well as laws on apostasy. Now, Hadi has come out to say that the G25 poses an intellectual threat to Muslims, and I think that's an interesting comparison to make, the intellectual threat versus, you know, comparing it to a group that took up arms and was clearly a militant group.
Yeah, I mean, because the question perhaps at the end of the day is who's most threatened by the intellectual efforts put out by G25? You know, is it the state, or is it in fact competing groups that have different visions of Malaysia and different visions of how the religion ought to be administered in the country, right? So that I see. So it's actually a threat to PAS, a threat to Hadi, it's a threat to those clerics who support their version of how Malaysia should be in relation to the religion of Islam. Right. I do think, though, what Hadi does politically in this is very interesting, because with all extremist groups, I think the middle ground is the most dangerous. It's not the non-Muslim who's the most threatening to the extremists. It's actually moderate Muslims. It's
the silent, moderate majority.
And in this case, not so silent, moderate Muslim, because they create a middle ground for which people can, all sides can come together. There can be some negotiation. It's based on reason. You know, these are well-researched statements that are produced in books. Yeah. All these things do not create the kind of polarizing effect that extremists in this country really want. So if you look at all the extremist groups, ultimately, the moderate Muslim is the most dangerous antagonist that they have.
There you go. All right, well, let's round up the week, shall we, with some good news. Malaysian writer Joshua Kam has won Singapore's Epigram Books Fiction Prize, which is often referred to as Singapore's richest literary prize. Epigram is a private publishing house, so just to make that clear. Now, this is the second time that a Malaysian has won the award, but at just 23 years old, Joshua is the youngest to win the 75,000 ringgit prize money. So he won for his manuscript titled How the Man in Green Saved Pahang and Possibly the World.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, on so many levels, and great that you know, a Malaysian has won an award and some international recognition. Elaine Chew out in Britain has been shortlisted for a prize that comes out of Manchester, and so on and so forth. I mean, Malaysians do well overseas, and they should be credited for it. The other thing that's quite fascinating is why Epigram, which is actually a private publisher, would now open up the criterion to include non-Singaporeans.
So previously, the Epigram Books prize was only restricted to Singaporean citizens, and this is, I think, the first time that they've opened it up to ASEAN writers. And this is quite interesting because Joshua beat out Singaporean Ernie Saleh, also a Californian Thai-based writer. We also have a University Brunei Darussalam professor who was shortlisted. So it's a truly, I guess, open competition. And it made me wonder whether, if this was a Malaysian book prize, whether we would also open up the submissions to international applicants or applicants from other countries to make sure that it's a truly competitive award.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one thing about competition in this particular case, Melissa, but also I think for Epigram, it's about finding talent, right? So Epigram, very well known for publishing the graphic novel by Sunny Liu, The Life and Times of Lim Hock Chai. The idea there is that you need to get talent in order to create bestsellers, and which can sell globally, right? So why would you limit yourself to your national boundaries and to only citizens, especially for a city-state that has a reasonably small population of less than 5 million people, right? So, and Singapore has a very long-standing discussion. It's really a debate, and there are pushbacks to the government's position there on talent, on accepting talent globally, because Singapore cannot afford to just play within its own borders.
Okay, but what I'm wondering is, I've never heard of Joshua Kam before, but I'm wondering why he was honoured in Singapore and perhaps looked over in Malaysia. I'm not sure whether he was, but I had hoped to have heard about him first through a Malaysian award as opposed to having heard about him through a Singaporean award.
Well, Melissa, it might have come about because he had submitted this manuscript for publication. So what the award does is it gives money, but it also then becomes part of the publishing plan. So the book is not yet published. It will be published this year. So
it's an advance on the publishing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that is what I think probably it's not. We always jump to the conclusion that perhaps, people were not honoured and there was some discrimination involved. It might not be that at all. It's just that Epigram is smart enough to say to themselves they need talent from as wide a catchment area as possible. They're not limiting themselves to Singaporeans.
And hopefully we will adopt the same approach. Now, coming up after this on Consider This, we're going to be taking a closer look at what to expect in the final hours before the Kimanis by-election. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you tonight. Now, all eyes will be on Kimanis tomorrow as its constituents cast their vote for whom they think should represent them in Parliament. So the Kimanis by-election will witness a one-on-one contest between Parti Warisan Sabah candidate Datuk Karim Bujang and Barisan National candidate Muhammad Alamin. So we have joining us on the line Dr. Vilasini Samaya with the Gender Studies program at University Malaya. Vila, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, you're there in Kimanis to observe the elections. So tell us your observations of the sentiment on the ground right now.
Well, first of all, guys, thanks so much for being so patient and having me, a disembodied voice from afar. I'm really speaking to you from a very, very wet, raining Kimanis currently. And I think the rain has certainly done something to really kind of change the energy around here currently. It's very interesting sort of driving into Kimanis and meeting the people on the ground, certainly, simply because at this point, the big question is who's going to win. And it's really down to the wire. I think it's anybody's game at this moment.
Well, that's fascinating because some pollsters are suggesting that this is a sure win for Warisan.
Right.
Tell us why you think that that the positions might be quite divided. That in fact, it's hard to call at this point.
Well, I think it's looking at two very important issues here. Number one, and the most obvious one, is that there is this incredibly aggressive anti-PSS or Pas Sementara Sabah, or in English, it would be loosely translated to the Sabah Temporary Pass, where it certainly brings out this sentiment, this stranger danger, anti-irregular migrant sort of sentiments, coming up into the fold. And this, of course, has been around in Sabah for decades, right? I mean, it's always the belief that the indigenous folks will lose out and have lost out to irregular migrants generally. So this is certainly one of the first issues as to why it is that it's a little bit, 50-50 in that sense, simply because I think Barisan National is incredibly aggressive with that narrative. They have been pushing it non-stop. If you're on the ground and essentially listening to areas in which Barisan National Barisan National party members have gone in and had conversations with the locals, is that if you give a vote to Warisan, you are essentially losing your rights in this particular area. And I think while it may not be seen as it can come across a bit ludicrous occasionally. There are members of the Kimanis community who have essentially bought into that. That is a real legitimate fear. Right. And the second issue, I think this goes across the board, is that it's bread and butter issues. Can people in Kimanis essentially live up to these kind of living standards that people say in Kota Kinabalu? Let's not use Kuala Lumpur as an example, but somewhere 2 hours away, Kota Kinabalu, can you live up to those standards? So I think it really boils down to that. And Barisan National has been very aggressive with that narrative.
Villa, there's also this question of what Warisan stands for. And if we cast our mind back to the last general elections, Warisan won on a very kind of Sabah-based rights, identity type of platform. What's happened to that? Why weren't they able to counter the narrative that they would be less than willing to protect the interests of Sabahans? And somehow allow for the PSS to be a route to citizenship. I mean, what exactly did not work for Warisan over this campaign period to stake their claim as protectors of Sabahan rights?
I'm going to be really frank here and say that Warisan has been really trying to play an inclusive card. They've been trying to come in and say, inclusivity for all Sabahans, right? And essentially they won on that emotional plea in GE14, is that Sabah has lost autonomy. We essentially cannot decide things for ourselves, be it the economy, be it politically. Our migration is a hack. So essentially, Warisan was able to win pretty much on that ticket. But what a lot of people tend to forget is that while they may have won the state, Barisan National as a party in Sabah essentially didn't actually lose. They had a lot of political froggers, as we call it, right? Guys who are essentially jumping over. So in that sense, Kimanis is still sort of resonating with this old glory of having voted for the previous candidate, Anifa Aman, in the past, and with quite a lot of strength as well. So coming into this, it's really about the kind of old tradition of voting for Barisan National on one hand. And on the other hand, it's a reminder by the Barisan National to those who may have voted for Barisan that, they haven't done as good a job as they have gloated to have done. They've been sort of tooting their own horns, and they can't really do that much better from Barisan National.
Right.
So essentially, this is anyone's game at this moment, and you have to remember that you have a lot to lose. And I think that says a lot to the people locally, essentially. It's not how much you have to gain.
Right. Villa, I have a question. So I understand that Datuk Sri Najib Razak is there on the ground campaigning as well. And I'm wondering what the general reception is when it comes to Peninsula-based politicians like Najib in this by-election.
Well, of course, with the people that we've spoken to with Najib's arrival, Najib is not the only Peninsular Malaysian who's actually around. I believe Azmin is also around at this moment. So there are sort of visits from ministers coming in from Kuala Lumpur to actually participate. Oddly enough, Malu Apa Bosku has seemed to be making quite a large amount of rounds actually in their local posters, and essentially the word has been revived quite greatly on the ground here in Kimanis. In speaking to locals about how they felt about it and whatnot, some would just sort of say, well, the word originated from here. But I think one thing that has been repeated over and over again locally is that how the elections in Kimanis essentially differs from that of the Peninsula of Malaysia is that race is not played up as much here, right? And I think you can't really do that in an area where Bumiputra-ness is sort of grey in that sense. While you may be a Muslim Bumiputra, you cannot be mistaken immediately for just being Malay, right? I think people are very clear and very loyal and very proud of their respective heritages here. So essentially, it's not really a game about race as it's so commonly used in the peninsula. It's actually really about indigeneity, and it's really about belonging, right? If you're an indigenous person to this area and you belong to this area, you therefore should have the right to so many other things. Do I have the right to decide whether or not I'm going to be at threat from, again, stranger danger? Do I have the right and the ability to live a life in which, it's more comfortable, and so on and so forth? So I think it really boils down to that at the moment.
Villa, what do you think the media might have missed in their reports about Kimanis?
I think the issue here is that if the anti-PSS issue has been played up so greatly, we tend to forget that when we talk about Sabah, it's always about indigenous persons or communities missing out. They've always been a forgotten bunch of people. And then there's this issue with irregular migrants and the kind of influx of almost, say, anywhere between 1 to 2 million people, is that they're not two separate conversations. They're really on the same spectrum here, right? And one issue impacts the other. If there are a group of people who will vote for Barisan Nasional tomorrow, on the line that they do not want the PSS to be passed, then it says something about indigeneity and the lack of belonging than it does about the strength of Barisan Nasional. Regardless who wins tomorrow, it's going to be a momentous win. It's going to tell us a lot about essentially where it is Sabah stands in the larger scheme of Malaysian politics. It will tell us essentially about how it is that the local electorates are voting, and essentially the kind of misunderstood and forgotten and willfully ignored needs of the local people. Because essentially what Sabahans need are, on top of autonomy, and even then, by then, those definitions are still incredibly grey, incredibly loose, is that they don't feel empowered. And if they don't feel empowered, a subject like the anti-PSS is going to scream volumes at them. And, it's going to be political fodder whoever uses it.
All right. Well, Villa, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us this evening. Really appreciate your time and calling in from Kimanis there. That was Dr. Vilasini Samaya with University Malaya. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on Consider This for this episode. I'm Melisa Idris with me, Sharaad Kutan, signing off, wishing you a happy weekend. We'll catch you next time. Thank you for watching and good night.